There's a lot of ways to improve your odds of qualifying in Cashout that don't just boil down to get good. Cashout as a game mode is very complex, and the strategies I'll be discussing will help ensure that you aren't relying on a lucky steal at the very last minute to qualify, but rather prepping yourself in advance so that you don't have to. Obviously, there'll never be a 100% guarantee, but this will at least make the odds of qualifying higher than if you weren't implementing any of these strategies. Even your average player solo queuing can use at least some of these ideas in their very next game with immediate success. Remember that these strategies are for players that aren't dropping several elims a game, but still want to win. If you are a decent player that gets elims easily, these will still work, but you probably won't need to use them as often to increase your odds of winning. Let's go over some quick numbers. Each qualifying round has 3 waves of vaults that spawn, with 2 cash boxes per wave, meaning a total of 6 cash boxes throughout the round. If you want to ensure that you're not completely relying on a last minute steal or cash out, you'll need to secure at least 2 of the 4 deposits and cash outs from the first 2 waves. I'm sure a lot of us could have already pieced this together from just playing, but I needed to make clear what our objectives should be before going into the strategies, because depending on how things played out will affect your approach for the final wave of vaults of the round. Now, how exactly can we make sure what we want happens more consistently? Well, it depends on how each wave of vaults plays out. So we need to go over possible scenarios for what might happen during waves 1 and 2 before tackling wave 3. At the start of every round, 2 teams spawn close to one vault, and the other 2 teams spawn closer to the other vault. Normally this results in 2 different fights happening, 1 at each vault spawn. We'll call this scenario 1, but in some cases, a team, or maybe even 2, decides to instead go for the further away vault, scenario 2. There's also a scenario where a team splits and goes for both vaults, scenario 3, and some very rare cases where a team will choose to camp a cash out station instead of fighting for a vault at all, scenario 4. In the normal scenario, where you're fighting only one other team, from the perspective of an average player, your priority should not be to team wipe them over running the cash. If you do wipe them, great. After they're wiped, you'll simply go and deposit your first cash box as normal, and of course, you'll want to choose the cash out station that will make it less likely for you to run into the other 2 teams. In cases where you can't wipe them, run the cash and deposit it above all else. Whether your teammates are alive or not, run the cash. Depositing the cash and defending it should always be the priority over getting elims or reviving your team during this stage of the match if wins are what you're after. If you're in a position where running the cash isn't possible, meaning your opponents are blocking your path in some way, or one of them already took it and it would be unwise to intercept, then reviving your team is the next best choice, or in the worst cases, whether intentionally or not, getting wiped as soon as you can so that you can all respawn together and minimize your team's overall downtime. If you die during the vault fight while your team is still up, don't use a coin unless your team gets a deposit off. There's not much to lose during this stage, so it's a waste. A couple of exceptions being if your team won't be reviving you anytime soon, and also don't seem like they'll be dying anytime soon. Or the fight turns into a 1v1 that looks like your team is going to lose without help. If you're a solo player and can't verbally coordinate with your team, run the cash yourself while your team stays to fight, but only if the fight looks like it's going south or is dragging on for far too long. In scenario 2, the scenario where a team decides to not go for the vault closest to them, and instead shifts directions to the further one, if you're alone at your vault, you'll just deposit the cash box as fast as you can. I've had cases where after depositing, it was possible to join the other fight, grab the cash, and leave to deposit it, but these cases are extremely rare. If it does end up happening, choose carefully whether it would be better to deposit the cash in your ongoing cash out, or to throw it into the other cash out station. And while we're on this topic, I recommend only trying this on light or medium. They're overall better for transporting vaults because of their superior mobility. Light with gateways and grappling hook are unmatched at grabbing a vault and getting out to deposit it, but other builds can work as well. If you're unlucky enough to get into the 3-team fight, don't even bother fighting at all if it can be avoided. Do whatever it takes to grab the cash box and get out. If all 4 teams are there, go for the other vault. Fighting when there isn't a cash out going is a waste of time. The same rules of scenario 1 apply here. If getting out with the cash box isn't a possibility, reviving is the next best thing, or getting wiped as soon as possible in the worst cases. Try to avoid getting stuck in a long drawn out fight at all costs. When scenario 3 occurs, the split team scenario, it means the players you're up against are probably confident enough that they think they can get away with both cash boxes. It can be hard to tell if a team is split up, but if you happen to notice this, that means they're probably implementing the same strategy I've repeated a few times. They're trying to get out with the cash box as fast as possible while avoiding unnecessary fights, or if they're absolutely insane, they're trying to team wipe everyone first. Let's assume they're not insane and are only going for the cash. Eliminating them could be more worth it than simply running away with the cash, like I recommended in the first 2 scenarios. You'd be forcing them to coin, which could later lead to an advantage. If you don't know whether it's a split team or not, grabbing the cash and depositing is priority as usual. If scenario 4 happens, the scenario where a team is camping the cash out station, there's no way to tell until you get there. I would not try to force your way in to deposit the cash. You can choose to either fight or go to the other cash out station. This is the toughest scenario for players that don't traditionally get a good number of elims, because you could get stuck not making it to the other cash out in time before another team shows up, or of course lose the fight at the cash out you were originally heading towards. These 4 scenarios were described using wave 1 of the vaults as reference, but this is mostly how every wave of vault spawns plays out, with one small difference that can happen after a wave, which causes the next wave to play differently. If a cash box isn't deposited quickly enough, it can cause the next wave to get staggered. Most of the time when this happens, the better choice is to go for the newest vault, rather than going for a steal on the staggered cash out. But of course, if you're the one that owns the cash out, you should defend it, or if a steal seems plausible, go for it. Although in most cases, teams tend to pile onto the ongoing cash out, rather than grabbing the vault, which leads to a messy fight that only one team gets any benefit out of, so stealing will most likely not be plausible. Based on the outcome of Stage 1, we are now left with 2 possible scenarios for Stage 2. If you were successful at depositing, you have a cash out to defend. Or if you were unsuccessful, you have a cash out you need to steal. Starting with defense, if you have the time, don't just stand around. You'll want to make it as difficult as possible for your opponents to reach your cash out. This means destroying or blocking off any stairs, ladders, bridges, zip lines, other entry points, and the likes. Placing any mines or traps you may have as well. If there's a gas canister nearby, I recommend placing it next to the cash out without setting it off right away. What I usually do is once the cash out is about halfway, I'll melee the canister so that it starts leaking, and a few seconds later it should explode. This will help defend your cash out without having to stare at it every moment to make sure no one is stealing. The same can be done with a flame barrel, but the gas is generally better. There's more that can be done for defense, but I first want to remind you all what it means to defend a cash out. Defending your cash out does not mean you have to eliminate your opponents. In fact, the ones trying to steal should be way more concerned with eliminations than the defenders. This means as a defender, if a fight isn't in your favor, if possible, you should prioritize surviving and only risk your life to prevent a cash out steal. With our defensive priorities straightened out, I want to talk about a few gadgets and some specializations that can help with defense, other than mines, goo, and barricades. These will help you defend your cache without being right on it, because being nearby is the first place an opponent will look when going for a cash out steal. If they can't find you nearby, the next thing they'll likely do is start stealing, and you don't need good aim to eliminate someone that's stealing. Some of these gadgets and specializations are Goo Gun, Winch Claw, Dematerializer, C4, Gateway, and Stun Gun. There are a lot more, but after explaining a few of these, you'll get the overall point. With the Goo Gun and Stun Gun, you'll be doing the same thing to prevent a steal. You'll have to be close enough to fire your gun at the person that's stealing to stop them. And if there's an opportunity for an elim, go for it. But in any other case, prioritize survival. These both require you to be a bit close, but they can still be used from a good distance. With the Winch Claw, you have 2 choices. Either use it to pull the cash out or to pull the player that's stealing it. The cash out is a safer and easier choice for survival, but pulling a player can easily lead to an elimination, and since they're standing still, it shouldn't be hard to pull them. With the Dematerializer, you also have 2 choices. Either use it to drop the cash out a floor down, or use it to open a window for you to wipe out the stealer from safety. With C4, place it on the cash out and detonate it during a steal. You don't have to necessarily detonate it right away, but if you're not sure if your C4 is still on the cash out or not, it's safer to detonate it immediately. This will obviously move the cash out and cancel the steal. A similar effect can be achieved with the RPG, Breach Charge, and Thermal Bore. The Gateway is an interesting one. I've praised this gadget before for all of its different uses, and defending a cash out is no exception. Lights in general aren't good at sticking around in one spot and surviving. They need to be extremely elusive to stay alive. With that being the case, the Gateway is the perfect tool to allow a light player to move around freely and still make it back to the cash out to prevent a steal. I like to put one side of the Gateway near the cash out while holding onto the other until it's time to protect it. Be sure to put it in a spot where people won't be staring directly at you once you go through it. You can combine this with the Stun Gun, or simply just eliminate the stealer once you teleport in. There will be times where more than one team shows up to take your cash out. In these situations, you should let the other teams fight it out as much as possible without intervening, because if we remember our priorities, there's no reason to fight unless our cash is being stolen. The gadgets and specializations we just went over should help prevent steals without getting too involved in the fights. Now, if you do end up fighting but can't get the team wipe, putting glitch traps, explosive mines, or pyro mines on enemy statues to make it more difficult to revive them can help you tremendously. Always keep an eye on how many mediums you're facing. If you're fighting a team and there's still a medium alive, you have to prevent a defib somehow, some way. Other than that, it's all dependent on you and whether or not you can win your engagements. There are rare cases where no one will show up to contest your cash out. If this happens, you've struck gold. You can now choose to go over to the other cash out and cause some commotion. This means staying at a distance and getting easy elims for extra cash. Or if you want, you might even be able to get away with a steal. Just be ready to use a coin if you fail, and be sure that your whole team doesn't show up unless it's 100% impossible for another team to steal your own cash. The easiest way to tell if all other teams are fighting for the other cash out is to check the scoreboard to see who is dead. If the 2 teams that don't own a cash out have a death, that means they have to be fighting somewhere else, and chances are it's at the other cash out. Be aware that if a team gets fully wiped, they have a chance of spawning near your cash out for a steal. Alright, time for scenario 2. The scenario we all hope that we don't have to deal with because it's illegal in many jurisdictions. But if we fail to deposit a cash out, what else is left for us to do other than turning to a life of crime? There are some choices that can be made here to make stealing a cash out easier. One choice is to check out the scoreboard to see if an underperforming team has a cash out going and fighting them, using the mine tactics I described for defense to help prevent any unwanted enemy revives. The downside is that while this will help you to qualify, this choice will lead to a harder final round because you're intentionally going after the weakest team. But this video is about choices that will help you qualify, not about how to make the final round easier. Another choice is avoiding a fight and trying to go for a sneaky steal if the opportunity presents itself. This can happen if the owner of the cash out is fighting somewhere else, or there's enough obstacles in their way that they couldn't possibly get to you in time. It's a somewhat rare occurrence, but as far as priority goes, it's number 2. The third choice is the traditional choice of going for a cash out that a single team is at and trying to wipe them and steal. If you can't find everyone to wipe, you'll have to move on to choice 4, the bait and steal. All this means is starting the steal, holding it for a second or two, and then canceling if someone shows up. And if no one shows up, the cash is all yours. The fifth choice is the last thing you'll want to do, but if there's no other option, it can work. Go in for the steal and use whatever you can to help yourself or your team's stealer stay alive. Barricades, shields, heal beam, goo, APS turret, and so on. Standing on top of your team's stealer to prevent damage or a steal cancel from things like the stun gun is also very helpful. This is part of what we're trying to avoid, but if it happens, it happens. If you're going for a steal and end up in a fight with multiple teams, let them fight it out, similar to how I described for our defensive strategies. With the difference being, you'll have to go in at some point for a steal, but hopefully it's when there are only a few opponents left, and you can either wipe them or go for a bait and steal. If you made it to the last wave of vaults in the top 2, congrats. That means you probably accomplished our goal. There's only a bit more you have to do to secure your qualification without relying on a desperate last-minute steal. What you do during these last vault spawns is very important. If you're in first place, the best way to secure qualification is to make sure both cash boxes end up in the same cash out. This will ensure that you can't be knocked out of the top 2 because there will only be one large source of cash rather than 2. If you fail and there's 2 cash outs going, you'll have to do the math to figure out if you have to steal one to qualify. If you don't, then staying alive for the remainder of the match is technically all you have to do. If you're in second place, using Season 3's numbers, you want to make sure to deposit at least one cash box for the $7,000 deposit bonus, and if that will put you in first, make sure that the old first place team doesn't deposit the other cash box by either keeping it away from them and allowing another team to grab it, or depositing it yourself into the cash out you already own. This will reduce your odds of getting knocked out in the same way I described for first place. If the cash boxes get deposited into different cash outs, you'll have to defend the one you have if you do in fact have one, or steal one using the strategies discussed earlier in this video. If you're in third place, this could be the only time where it would be acceptable to try and split the final wave's cash boxes. Depositing both in the same cash out could put you in second place, but that leaves you to defend your cash out against every team other than first if they choose not to participate. Splitting them means that last place is less likely to pass you in points, and you still have an opportunity to qualify as long as second place doesn't get the other cash out. Second place is your biggest threat to winning, so eliminating them is the best way to secure a qualification. If you're so far back in points that second place is unreachable without both cash boxes being deposited together, then you unfortunately have no other choice. If you're in fourth place, you have to absolutely, with very rare exception, make sure both cash boxes get deposited into one cash out. The rare exception being if the second, third, and fourth place teams are close enough in points to each other that it's up in the air which team will end up in second place. Splitting it will still not make this wave any easier, but it's an option. It won't make it easier because the only way you'll end up qualifying in this situation is if first place gets one cash out and your team gets the other. All other outcomes will result in a loss. In a lot of matches, last place is dead last with not much chance of getting out. So in those games, make sure the cash boxes get deposited together and you're the one to cash it out. As a quick tip, if there's still a vault left on the map during the final wave while a cash out is going, do the math to see if it's worth getting it and depositing to help you qualify. Sometimes that extra deposit bonus is enough to make you qualify. This is probably the most in-depth video I've ever made. A lot of thought was put into it. Probably too much to be honest. I hope that I brought up ideas that you never considered and that this information was helpful. Thanks for watching.